Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to give you a method on how to change your 3D world, manipulate your outside world simply by rearranging your mental conversations. There's actually some experiments that were done, and I'm going to give you an illustration in this chapter, in this video today for you. Welcome back to the channel, guys. This is chapter 7, Attitude, the Power of Awareness by Neville Goddard. We're first going to get into the experiments that were conducted at Princeton and Dartmouth. Okay, so experiments recently conducted at Princeton and Dartmouth in the latter psychology laboratory handed over prove that what you see when you look at something depends not so much on what is there as the assumption you make when you look. So this is part of the law of assumption. Basically, what it's being proven now that the law of assumption is real. Actually, this was done quite a long time ago. There's a lot of experiments that have been done after this as well that show this with quantum physics, like string theory and such. Okay, so basically the law of assumption, the way you look at something, it changes it. So when you look at something, depending on what your assumption is that you have of something before you look, actually changes and manipulates it. So you can actually manipulate your world by just changing your assumptions of it. The way that you observe your world will actually change that portion of reality that you will experience and manipulate your world and shift to those parallel realities where you just extend your feelers into an entirely different world. Okay, so and you do this through the law of assumption, and these experiments are showing just that. All right, so since what we believe to be the real physical world is actually only an assumptive world, it is not surprising that these experiments prove that what appears to be solid reality is actually the results of expectations or assumptions. So your expectations or assumptions are actually what is creating your world that you see outside. Your 3D world is being created by your expectations, your observations, your assumptions. And this is all being proven with scientific study. All right, guys, so your assumptions determine not only what you see, but also what you do, for they govern all your conscious and subconscious movements towards the fulfillment of themselves. So over a century ago, this truth was stated by Emerson as follows: as the world was plastic and fluid in the hands of God, so it is ever to so much of his attributes as we bring to it. To ignorance and sin it is flint. They adapt themselves to it as they may, but in proportion as a man has anything in him divine, the firmament flows before him and takes his signet and form. Your assumption is the hand of God molding the firmament into the image of that which you assume. The assumption of the wish fulfilled is the high tide which lifts you easily off the bar of the senses where you have so long lain stranded. It lifts the mind. It lifts the mind into prophecy in the full right sense of the word. And if you have that controlled imagination and absorbed attention, which it is possible to attain, you may be sure that all your assumption implies will come to pass. So everything that you're trying to create with your new assumptions will come to pass, will come into fruition, will be externalized in your 3D world. All right, so when William Blake wrote, "What seems to be is to those to whom it seems to be," he was only repeating the eternal truth. There is nothing unclean of itself. I mean, it's one energy, guys. Nothing is separate. It's an illusion of separateness. We've gone over this. But to him that esteemeth anything that is unclean, to him it is unclean. That's Romans 14:14. All right, so because there is nothing unclean of itself or clean of itself, you should assume the best and only think of that which is lovely and a good report. Because if we're all one being. If we're all one being, there's nothing that is unclean or clean of itself. That means we are all the same. You and I are the same being. So you should always assume the best and think only, because you don't want to hurt yourself, right? I mean, you got to look at, even if you got to look at it that way, always think of the best. Always think of what is lovely and of good report in like Philippians 4:8, because we are all the same being. So this is where it really starts to go to that next level. Okay, so it is not superior insight, but ignorance of this law of assumption. If you read into the greatness of men some littleness, with which you may be familiar, or into some situation or circumstance, an unfavorable conviction. Okay, so let me get to it here. Your particular relationship to another influences your assumption with respect to that other and makes you see in him that which you do see. Okay, so if you can change your opinion of another, then what you now believe of him cannot be absolutely true, but is only relatively true. So basically like what Einstein did with the law of relativity. So if you can change your opinion of someone, then what you now believe of him cannot be absolutely, it can't be true. It's all based on your assumptions of why your world is the way that it is relative to your assumptions. So your world is all relative to your observations and assumptions of it. So if you change your assumptions, relatively, everything else has to change. So this is where this really gets exciting, because you can actually change things by changing your concept of self. Because ultimately, when you change your concept of self, you start imagining that you are a different person, then your world has to change with it, because it has to be relative. Your world has to be relative to your observations of it and your assumptions of the world you're actually living in. So then it comes back to the infinite parallel realities that will also come into play with this, because then you'll transfer to that different world depending on your assumptions. So you change your assumption, you change your world. You transfer to a different world when you change your assumptions. Okay, so I'm going to give the illustration, the story here. One day, a costume designer described to me, this is Neville Goddard talking here about a costume designer. Okay, so one day, a costume designer described to me her difficulties in working with a prominent theatrical producer. She was convinced that he unjustly criticized and rejected her best work, and that often he was deliberately rude and unfair to her. Okay, so upon hearing her story, I explained that if she found the other rude and unfair, it was sure sign that she herself was wanting that, and that it was not the producer but herself that was in need of a new attitude. And then Neville Goddard told her that the power of this law of assumption, told her about it, and its practical application could be discovered only through experience, and that only by assuming that the situation was already what she wanted it to be, she could prove that she could bring about the change desired. Her employer merely bearing witness, or echoing or mirroring back to her mental conversations, that she could bring about the change desired. Her employer was merely bearing witness, telling her by his behavior what her concept of him was. So not only can you change your concept of yourself, but you can change your concept of somebody else's concept of self, and that will change your world as well. I suggested that it was quite probable that she was carrying on mental conversations with him in her mind, which were filled with criticism and recriminations. There was no doubt but that she was mentally arguing with the producer, for others only echo that which we whisper to them in secret. I asked her if it was true that she talked to him mentally, and if so, what those conversations were like. So basically, if you have anything going on in your life right now, you can use this, to change your world right now. So if you're having any conflict with someone, or somebody's not treating you the way that you want them to treat you, then it's based on your mental conversations and your concept that you have of that person. So you're creating these things to happen to you, because the world is externalized from you. So you can change your world by changing your assumptions of it and your conceptions of your concepts of the people in your world, of how you feel about them. Okay, so when Neville Goddard actually broke this down to her and explained to her about the law of assumption and about how her mental conversations and her concepts of this person are what is creating this, she confessed that every morning on her way to work, that she would actually criticize and argue with her boss or her producer, that she would never have dared address him in person. She was doing it in her mind. So she had this anger towards him, but she would never dare actually say it to him in the 3D world. She was saying it in her mind. So these mental conversations were very conflicting, were very offensive. So the intensity and force of her mental arguments with him automatically established his behavior towards her. So when she was having these negative conversations, these conflicting conversations with her boss or producer in her mind, it was establishing and creating this automatically. automatically creating his behavior towards her. Okay, so then she's going to fix it here. So she began to realize that all of us carry on mental conversations, but unfortunately, on most occasions, these conversations are argumentative. And that we only have to observe the passerby on the street to prove this assertion that so many people are mentally engrossed in conversation, like everyone's having mental conversations, constantly. You can observe somebody by themselves. They're having mental conversations, whether they're positive or negative. Everyone is having mental conversations, but we can control that. Once you start learning this, you can actually take this and actually start manipulating and changing your world to what you want it to be. That so many people are mentally engrossed conversation, if you appear to be happy about it. But the very intensity of their feeling must lead them quickly to the unpleasant incident they themselves have mentally created, and therefore must now encounter. Okay, so when she realized what she had been doing, she agreed to change her attitude and to live this law faithfully by assuming that her job was highly satisfactory and her relationship with the producer was a very, very happy one. And to do this, she agreed that before going to sleep at night, on her way to work and at other intervals during the day, she would imagine that he had congratulated her on her fine designs and that she, in turn, had thanked him for his praise and kindness. So she's creating a new mental image. Mental conversations are coming back from the mental image. So she's creating an entirely new scene, an entirely new world. So she's shifting realities here. She's shifting from the reality where her boss is always talking down to her and always being negative and always treating her unfairly because of her assumptions. But now she's changing her assumptions and mental conversations. She's shifting to a different parallel reality that where her boss is actually a completely different person. Okay, so to her delight, she soon discovered for herself that her own attitude was the cause of that which befell her. The behavior of her employer miraculously reversed itself. She shifted into the new parallel reality. His attitude, echoing as it always had done, that which she had assumed, now reflected her changed of concept of him. What she did was by the power of her imagination. Her persistent assumption influenced his behavior and determined his attitude towards her. With the passport of desire of the wings of a controlled imagination, she traveled into the future and her own predetermined experience. So you can do this in your own life right now. If you're having any issues with a relationship partner or your boss at work, you can change this by assuming a different version of this person. So if this person is not a good person, start assuming that they are, changing your mental conversations and falling asleep, either with my meditations, which will automatically change your mental conversations as you're falling asleep. But you can also do this, manually. You can do this yourself and actually just create a scene or affirmations where this person is now the person that you would want them to be. And your mental conversations change that. So then your assumptions and your projections of your world and the parallel realities are going to start to shift, and you'll see a different version of the same exact person. So thus, we see it as not facts, okay? So life, there are no facts, okay? Imagination creates. But that which we create in our imagination, which shapes our lives, for most of us, the conflicts of the day are due to the want of a little imagination to cast the beam out of our own eye. It is the exact and literal minded who live in a fictitious world. As this designer, by her controlled imagination, started the subtle change in her employer's mind, so can we, by the control of our own imagination and wisely directed feeling, solve our problems. So control your own imagination and wisely direct what you're assuming. So be conscious. That's why I go over so many exercises like the leaf exercise and in the reverse course, reversing the day's events in reverse order, reversing all that and developing the muscle of the mind. That way you can be presently aware and actually hear or see and be aware of your mental conversations when you're having them. And you can actually be observant of that and then start changing them. When you're having these negative mental conversations, you can catch yourself and then notice when you're doing it and be like, nope, okay, so I'm not going to assume that this person is this way, and I'm not going to assume that that's just the way it has to be, because it's not. It's all they're all echoing back your mental conversations that you have of them. Even though they're doing something, even right now, your world is not the way it is, and you can't believe that you'd be like, this person is just a bad person. That there is a great version of that person in a parallel reality that you can't connect to at any time. So remember that when your life isn't the way, you have people in your life that are criticizing you, that are not treating you the way that you want, change your mental conversations of that person and your concept, like the concept that you hold of that person, not yourself so much, but of that person. Change the way you look at this person and imagine them as being the person that you wanted them to be. And then this will shift sometimes very quickly, like in this case, this illustration. But even if it's a gradual change, you'll start noticing it. And then once you start experiencing this to actually take place in your world, you'll believe it. And then you'll start really putting the work in for everyone in your life and start shifting to parallel realities where everyone in your life is the way that you want them to be, and they're treating you good, like just like you're treating, yourself, basically from your mental conversations that you have. Okay, so by the intensity of her imagination and feeling, the designer cast a kind of enchantment on her producer's mind. So you can do the same exact thing. You can cast enchantment on your world or the people in your world, which will cause them to think that their new thoughts originated from you, but really it's just a different parallel reality where you've changed versions of the people in your life. All right, so often the most elaborate and original thoughts are determined by another. We should never be certain that it was not some woman treading in the winepress who began that subtle change in men's mind, or that the passion did not begin in the mind of some shepherd boy lighting up his eyes for a moment just before it ran upon its way. William Butler Yeats. All right, guys, we got the next chapter. That is chapter 8, Renunciation. This is a very good chapter. I'm beginning to that next, but let's give you a quick little recap here. All right, guys, so your assumptions determine not only what you see, but also what you do, for they govern all your conscious and subconscious movements towards the fulfillment of themselves. So do an exercise. If there's somebody in your world right now that you are in conflict with, or they're treating you in a way that you don't like, change your mental conversations and your concept of that person that you hold. Change them. If they're not a good person now, imagine something that they're telling you, something that they normally wouldn't tell you, but something great about yourself, like, wow, you really did incredible today with this, or you're doing it. I haven't told you this in forever, but I absolutely love you and I miss you and you're doing such a great job. Create mentally rehearse something that's going to change your concept of that person right before you go to sleep at night. Change that mental conversation and watch and see what happens, and start experiencing these changes yourself. And when you start experiencing these changes, then you will understand how much power you have to transition or change parallel realities and to actually change the people in your life and change and transform your world just by basically just changing your mental conversations that you have of that person. All right, guys, I love you guys very much, and I will see you guys in the next video. And don't forget to give me one thing you guys are grateful for.